Welcome to the Author Roundup. This special segment of the Book Connection show features up-and-coming indie authors who sit down with us and talk about their recently released books. Join us as we chat with our next guest author. Hello there, and welcome back to Author Roundup. My name is Emma, and I will be your host for today's episode. For today's episode, we have author Michael Weiner. Michael is a seasoned pediatric oncologist who turned to creative writing through Columbia's narrative medical program. We'll dive into his latest fiction novel, Both Sides of the Same Coin, a gripping tale set in the 20th century New York City that explores the intertwining fates of four families against the backdrop of historical events and the unpredictable nature of life. Hi, Michael. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you, Emma. That was a superb summary of both sides of the same coin. Thank you for that.
Oh, yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So, yeah, can you tell us a little bit about your book, a little synopsis, and then we can get more into details of your book?
Yeah, well, I'd like to probably just to back up for a moment. As you mentioned, I spent a 40 plus year career as a pediatric oncologist caring for patients with
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that.
with cancer, uh,
Okay.
primarily children with cancer. And
Mhm.
most of my career was at Columbia University Medical Center and the New York Presbyterian Hospital. About 15 or so years ago, I was introduced to a program by Dr. Rita Sharon, who began a narrative medicine program to assist faculty at the medical school and staff in dealing with their own thoughts about healthcare,
Mhm.
patients, and so forth. And
Mhm.
as you can imagine, pediatric oncology is a very heart-wrenching subspecialty.
Mhm.
And I was the director of the division at the time, and I thought this would be something that all of our staff and faculty would benefit from. So we introduced it, and it was fantastic. And we would get together on a monthly basis, and we would write reflections about what transpired during the last week or the last month and so forth. And I found that I really enjoyed the writing.
Wow.
So during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic in 2020, uh,
Mhm.
I wrote my first book, which is called Living Cancer: Stories of a Oncologist Father Survivor, which involved reflections about six patients that I cared for and their families,
Mhm.
my own daughter's cancer journey, and then my own experience with cancer. So I had a view
Oh,
of cancer from 360 degrees as a caregiver, as a parent, and then someone who was dealing with the disease itself. I wrote a second book about observations that I had at the medical center, but
mhm.
and I really enjoyed the experience of sitting down and writing.
Mhm.
And I began this book, Both Sides of the Same Coin, really as a memoir. But
Okay.
and I started to write about some friends and family that I had, and I realized that what really was enjoyable was allowing my mind and to take me down any path. And I quickly decided that the memoir was not the way I wanted to go, was not the journey I wanted to take, that to write using these relationships of friends and family as a basis, but really fabricating
Right.
a story. So
Traumatized. Yeah.
that's how this began. I'm pleased to tell you that the writing experience was incredibly enjoyable. I
Oh,
did
great.
not experience what one might call a writer's block or an author's block at any time.
Oh,
The story just flowed, and I it was an experience that I'd like to do again.
oh, wow. That's so That's so cool. So yeah, I didn't know that you had previously written two books. So that's really interesting. So as far as like the reflections in the meetings that you had with your colleagues, so those type of reflections helped you to write like your first two books then, as far as like your personal experiences and then what you were dealing with as far as like within like the hospital.
Well, I wouldn't say it helped me write the two books, but what I found was that hour that I
Mhm.
spent with my colleagues in the narrative medicine program was a very enjoyable experience, that I
Mhm.
liked writing. I found a rebirth in my interest in creative writing when the pandemic of 2020 began, and I had the hospital clearly was a place that changed dramatically. And in
Mhm.
fact, I was not present at the hospital. I was going through my own therapy at the time, and it was not a safe environment for me. So
Mhm.
I just sat down and began to write this book about my experiences with patients and my daughter and myself.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful experience.
So what did your family and your colleagues think of the writing and approach that you took as far as publishing these types of subject matters?
It became, quote, my thing, if you will, but it continues to this day. And in fact, when I completed both sides of the same coin, the ending happens in such a manner that it really lends itself to the sequel, which I have
Oh,
which I have already begun to write.
oh,
So
that's exciting.
so I envision another year of bliss, if you will,
Yeah.
as I continue the story of the offspring of the original families.
Wow. Okay, so you mentioned that so this book you were taking a memoir approach, but you reflected and you're like, I actually don't want to do that. So it's a fictionalized, dramatized fiction book, right?
It is 100% fabricated.
Okay.
Yes, I've heard the phrase used by others, this book is true except when it's not. So,
I like
and I think that's where this story took me.
okay. So I went over the book a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the subject and the characters and things like that?
Well, yes, it's as you correctly stated, there are four families, one who all emigrate to this country. Uh,
Mhm.
One family is a Jewish family who a teenage boy leaves Russia and emigrates to the United States to avoid persecution at home. And the first chapter deals with his journey from Russia, meeting a friend, coming to this country alone, finding relatives on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and creating a life for himself. The
Mhm.
second family is an Irish family whose ancestors came to this country during the Irish potato famine in the 1850s, and how his grandfather and father were involved in the construction business, building the Brooklyn Bridge. They became involved in Tammany Hall, and then Patrick Doyle
Mhm.
is this character. The third is the son of the mafia don who comes to the United States in 1925 when Mussolini took power in Italy, and
Mhm.
he rid Italy of the quote mafia. And these figures went spread around the world, but this particular family, the Carbone family, came
Mhm.
to New York. And the fourth individual is Oscar Klein, who was actually an orphan from Philadelphia, who was a street kid, a hard-nosed kid who comes to New York, befriends Patrick Doyle, who at this time owns an Irish pub in Hell's Kitchen in New York City, and Anthony Carbone, the son of the mafia don, who is a police officer on Walking the Beat. They form a company
Mhm.
called KCD, and KCD originally purchases taxi cab medallions in the late 30s, and they had a very successful business, and they also were entrepreneurial and
Mhm.
started parking garages, and they made a lot of money doing these, the
Mhm.
parking garage, taxi cabs, transportation services, parking
Mhm.
garages, restaurants. KCD became a very prominent local business, and led by Oscar Klein, who was a Damon Runyon type of character, who was larger than life, and made some very good decisions, and was involved with the mayor of New York and the police commissioner and the fire commissioner and so forth. And at Oscar's wedding, he faces a problem because Anthony tells him that his father, Luca Carbone, wants to attend the wedding, and he has to deal with the fact that the mafia don is going to sit at the same table as the mayor. So
Oh gosh.
it was an interesting.
That is. Okay, so we've got so four families. So each of the families you said are immigrants for different reasons, religious freedom, mafia, persecution, the potato famine. How did you develop these motivations and how do they shape like the character's identity throughout the story?
Yeah, so they had to get here. They had to
Yeah.
get to the United States, right? So
Mhm.
obviously the other thing that was really a lot of fun about the book is that despite the fact I spent a career as a physician, I have always really enjoyed history. And
Mhm.
I found that the book is very accurate with respect to events of the 20th century, and the events of World War One and the
Mhm.
Depression and the Second World War and the Vietnam War shaped the decisions and the actions of these families.
Mhm.
And the locations of neighborhoods of the city, from the Lower East Side to Hell's Kitchen to Little Italy to the Palmetto Social Club, where Luca Carbone and his minions, meet on a daily basis, is is
Yeah,
is, is really
accurate.
very accurately described. So that was really a lot of fun to be able to intertwine the lives of the families and have history really shape decisions and things and decisions that they made. The
Mhm.
the other thing that I did, Emma, was that I wanted to really address some important social issues, if you will. So there is a story, part of the story, one of the Doyle children has severe learning disabilities, dyslexia, and ADHD. And her sister is a very popular student athlete, but Olivia, not so much. And
Mhm.
one night, Olivia and her friends are walking in Riverside Park, which is park along the Hudson River on the west side of Manhattan. They leave the park after midnight, clearly inebriated. She steps
Mhm.
off the curb and gets hit by a car.
Mhm.
So I dealt with her disability and what it took, the strength that it required of her to overcome paralysis, being in a wheelchair, and reshaping her life as a student. So I dealt with Olivia's disability, but also the fact that Olivia chose as a career to start a charity, and her
Mhm.
charity was raised money for people with spinal cord injury and to do
Mhm.
research in spinal cord injury. And
Mhm.
her partner in this enterprise was a football player who had a severe head injury playing football, and she and the football player create this charity, and it becomes a very reputable charity that raises a lot of money for patients and research in spinal
Mhm.
cord injury. I also wanted to address the importance of the rise of women in the workplace. So I
Mhm.
had three very powerful women who were in financial services, and I wanted they created a company that was women for women,
Oh,
and
wow.
they only gave raised money for companies that were involved, started by and did work for women, whether
Mhm.
it was medical research, whether it was a company that dealt with geothermal heating systems to overcome climate change and reduce the carbon footprint. This is something else that was important. And I spoke about I addressed very briefly the LGBTQ community because there is a relationship between two women, and they marry and have a life together.
Wow.
And there's drug addiction, and I spoke about the perils of drug addiction and rehab through drug addiction, and unfortunately the great recidivism in
Mhm.
relapse rate and
Mhm.
so forth. So it deals with a lot of very current issues that were part of the 20th century.
That's great. I'm so, like, intrigued the way you thought of so many different aspects you could tie into the book, the social aspects that you were talking about. And, I mean, you said that you didn't want to write a memoir, but this does feel very much like a book that, came from you as far as you pull a lot of things from, like, your medical experience and your personal experience because you're from the area. So, mentioning that it's, like, historically accurate, I 100% believe that because you're from the area and you're so passionate about it. So that's really cool the way you tied a lot of these things together.
I wanted, I had a theme,
Mhm,
and that was that two themes actually. One was that life is very random. Despite the great success that these families enjoyed, whether
mhm,
it be through that KCD partnership in taxis,
mhm,
restaurants, parking garages, real estate development, and so forth. The theme that I really wanted to focus on, that life is random,
okay,
because each of these families experienced tremendous tragedy and
mhm,
adversity, and
mhm,
how they would overcome it, whether it was the drug addiction or
right,
disability. And the other theme was, Emma, that was important to me, was to demonstrate the importance of giving back to the
okay,
community, doing charitable work, working in the Don's wife, Luca Carbone's wife, Maria, works at a hospital on the North Shore of Long Island on a pediatric cancer ward. So I
mhm,
guess that was a
good
personal
theme. Yeah,
reflection.
yeah,
But I also spoke about illness. There was an early death from pancreatic cancer, and I described what being a pancreatic cancer patient is like, and the
yeah,
surgery involved, and a mass. Maria Carbone dies of the disease, but I also speak about heart disease and
yeah,
the development of assist devices and heart transplant,
mhm,
and giving back to the heart program at the hospital so that others might benefit from it. So the
mhm,
randomness and giving back were two themes of the story that were really very important to me.
okay, great. And as far as so there's 4 families, there's, a lot of different struggles going on and personal experiences and situations. How is the book itself laid out? What was the approach you took as far as dividing chapters and, like, POV, point of view? What was your strategy and thought process through how you wanted to write the book from start to finish?
Yeah, so I would say the arc of the story is the initial meeting of the families, how life put them to, together, how they meet,
Together.
how they interact, how they endure adversity.
Yeah.
In each chapter, I tried to include something unforeseen that
Okay.
would say, "My goodness, I can't believe that happened to these people." So there is that kind of surprise. There is also each chapter is has elements of each of the families in it. It's not a chapter per.
Okay.
It involves all of them, and I thought that that made it a little bit more interesting, for the reader. And there's a description about how these families were very close. They
Hmm.
vacationed together. They went on the Mafia Don, Luca Carbone had a mega yacht called the Sicilian Dream. And the Sicilian Dream, one holiday season, everyone, and including the children, went on a Caribbean cruise. And I describe visiting each of the islands in the Caribbean during the week. And unfortunately, that chapter concludes with Oscar Klein, who doesn't feel so well and has a massive stroke and dies. So the book has that kind of great joy, but also sadness to it.
Oh yeah, which is life itself.
There's a ski trip that the families take to Vail, Colorado, and the teenage boys are skiing the back bowls and get caught in an avalanche.
Oh, wow.
And the avalanche proved deadly, and there were people who died, including two children, two of the boys of these families.
Families.
So
Oh,
how the parents had to deal with the loss
yeah.
of a child.
Mhm.
And the ending also, I think, is kind of unexpected.
So you mentioned that I like the way you mentioned talking about the introductions of the families and how you really thought, as an author, you thought about what the reader will take from it, or putting yourself in the reader's shoes. So I can gather from the way you talk about your book, you've really thought about that in certain scenes and scenarios. You have thought about that. And that's really good as an author to think about, okay, what would my reader think about this or respond to this? So that's really
I,
great.
I tried I tried I tried to create a story that that had a surprise in it, where the reader would say, I didn't see that coming, or
Yeah,
my
great.
goodness, how did that happen?
Hmm.
Just to demonstrate that life is random. I personally am a person of deep faith, not of religion, but of faith. And
Hmm.
I believe that things happen for a reason. I do not practice organized religion, but I believe in God. And
Hmm.
I wanted to demonstrate that God creates and God takes away.
Hmm.
And the randomness that the best laid plans often go awry. That
Right.
it you just don't know what's lurking around the corner.
Hmm.
Who would have thought that two boys from these families would be killed in an avalanche?
Yeah.
Right? Who would think that the Mafia Don would be assassinated? Right? Who would have guessed that there was one of the major characters in the story, had a spectacular life,
Mhm.
student, athlete, great, and had a fabulous job in real estate, but is a drug addict. Gave it all away.
I mean, it's unpredictable, and readers love unpredictability for sure. So that's great.
I'm a little bit biased, obviously, but
Yeah,
one of the things that I do, Emma, is that I am a voracious reader.
really.
And I think that certainly reading allows me to have a perspective as a writer. But
Hmm.
if someone handed me this book and said, "I think you'll like this," and I read it, I would thank them. It's
Hmm.
just a good story.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. I do want to talk about one of the characters, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I know you mentioned a little bit about Oscar Klein, but just going back, he is like introduced in the story as a orphan with no formal education, but becomes one who ties the families together in a sense. What inspired, because he is a huge character in your novel, what inspired his character, and how does his lack of formal education contrast with his found success, because that's very inspiring in itself.
He was a kid of the streets. He was raised in an orphanage in Philadelphia,
Mhm.
and one night just decided, I'm going to New York. And he hitches a ride through the with a truck driver who was coming driving on the turnpike and through and drops him on the west side of Manhattan in Hell's Kitchen. And he's about 15 or 16. He picks up odd jobs. He walks into this bar and says, "You need any help? I'll take out the garbage. I'll wash the dishes." So he meets Patrick Doyle, and Patrick actually is an orphan himself. This I should mention this to you because this is an interesting twist. Patrick's father was killed in the First World War.
Mhm.
He was at the Battle of the Bulge, and he, as as hundreds of thousands of soldiers, was killed during the First World War, and he's buried in a cemetery in France where there are 10,000 American doughboys, which is what American GIs were called during the First World War. The family is distraught. There are no remains, and his mother is just cannot deal with the loss of her husband. Her immune system is weakened, and she gets the Spanish flu, which is the epidemic in 1918 that came to this country, and she dies and leaves Patrick an orphan. So
Mhm.
he's raised by a family in Hell's Kitchen whose thought the father of the family was a New York City fire department captain.
Mhm.
And so Patrick and Oscar are both orphans. So they
Mhm.
have that kind of connection.
Yeah.
And Oscar, read in the newspaper that New York City was going to sell taxi medallions. And he said, "Let's buy a taxi cab. Let's buy a medallion." So the medallions cost $10 at the time. So they bought 10 medallions for $100. The problem was they had no taxi cabs. Oh, they needed another partner to help them purchase the cab. So they bought checker cabs, which in New York City was this particular manufacturer. And I went into the history of the checker cab being manufactured in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And
Oh, so cool.
so they ended up having a taxi garage in Queens, and they have 10 cabs, and they hire drivers, and Oscar drives himself, and he picks up a fare, and that's how he meets his wife, Mildred. So
Wow.
it was
So cool.
an interesting that Patrick
Yeah.
and Oscar meet, and Oscar just had a nose, had a sense of he was able to it, and there are men and women who are like that. They see the window open, they see the door open, and they're able to walk through it. And
Right.
that's the kind of person that he was.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned that he decided he was going to go to New York, and sometimes random acts of just, wanting to go for it and just, take a risk is what makes someone so inspiring and sets the precedent for their life. And so that's really cool. So you mentioned KCD. Incorporated, right, is a central part of your novel and the success of some of the characters. How did you approach writing about the business ventures they pursue, and how does their success reflect the, I guess, American dream in the
Yeah.
context of time
So
period?
actually there was I have a had a friend whose dad owned taxi medallions. So I it seemed that I and as I mentioned when I originally sat down to write, I thought it would be a memoir and I was going to
Yeah.
include this particular friend in the memoir. And his father owned taxi medallions.
Okay.
And so that seemed like a natural. And
Yeah.
Oscar's son Richard, who was really a very central figure, was went to college and law school, and he got a job at a very prominent law firm and was an expert in the early days of mergers and acquisitions and was involved in the purchase of a very large company, which kind of mirrors what some of the large venture capital firms do. And he went to work for this firm, which is called Frank and Manchester, and he makes a fortune. I mean, a literal, he makes a fortune of money. And I describe his life as, private planes and helicopters and yachts and tickets, as box seats at Yankee Stadium and the football giants and the best restaurants and whatever. But Richard has some issues as well, and he loses a son in the avalanche, and he can't deal with that, and eventually his life ends prematurely when he's having breakfast with his contemporaries, and they die in the terrorist attacks on 9/11. So
So you mentioned that, and there are a lot of historical events and things throughout your book. And you're from New York, so how much research went into this that you had to seek out versus you're an avid reader, you said. How much did you already know? So how much was brought in from both sides for your book?
yes, doing the research today, I found to be relatively straightforward and uncomplicated.
Yeah,
Everything, everything is available through a search engine or through AI.
yeah,
My goodness, the amount of information. For
right.
an example would be, I decided to have one of the families live in a town in Westchester County called Chappaqua, right? So
Okay.
Chappaqua is about 30 miles north of New York City,
Okay.
and it's where Horace Greeley, who was the founder of the Republican Party, lived.
Oh
And
wow.
in fact, the high school in Chappaqua is called Horace Greeley High School. So, where Reader's Digest, there used to be a little publication called Reader's Digest, which
Yeah.
was the most popular magazine
It is.
in America. And the
Yeah.
headquarters from Reader's Digest are in Chappaqua. And the
Oh
founder of
wow.
Reader's Digest was a man named Wallace, and I live on Wallace Way. So it kind of
Wow. It ties
to find
together.
yeah, to find this information was really very cool. One of the other families lives in Forest Hills Garden,
Mhm.
which is an enclave of affluence in Queens, where there are huge private homes surrounding the original West Side Tennis Club, which was the home of the U.S. Open tennis tournament. So I described the stadium and what Forest Hills Garden looked like and what the homes were built in a particular style, and I went through that as well. So it was really enlightening to be able to uncover all of the information.
So I think from what, I've gathered, you do a really good job as far as balancing both history and and character development. Did you think about how did you ensure both elements remained compelling without overshadowing the other?
Think that the historical events shaped decisions that were made. You-
Okay, gotcha.
it's to me, it's an unknown question about men and women of power create history or do they react to history?
Oh, yeah.
Do, do
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? So the story is the history of the families
Mhm.
living and reacting to events that are swirling around them.
Right. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so I know what inspired the idea for your book. So as far as when did you have the idea for this book and when did you start piecing things together and start writing it?
I as soon as I finished my second book, which is called Bad Behavior, I wanted to begin something else. I retired from practice as a pediatric oncologist in 2022.
Oh, wow.
And I wanted to be able to do something constructive.
Okay.
So part of every day or most days was reading, exercising, writing, and
Mhm.
spending time with grandchildren.
It's a good
So and I feel so fortunate to be able to enjoy this time of my life.
Mhm.
And I carved out most days an hour or two, and I've always been thinking whether I would be walking the dog or playing golf or
Yeah.
doing whatever. I would always be thinking about angles and how I would present certain.
Mhm. Yeah. So that's very recent then. Do you like your new life or do you ever miss your career as an oncologist?
No,
How's that been
no,
for you?
I do not miss it at
You
all.
don't miss it.
I feel I don't mean to sound saccharine, but I feel very, very fortunate that I'm able to be where I am
That's
in
good.
my life. I have a wonderful partner for 48 years. My wife and I are together 48 years.
Oh, wow.
Children and grandchildren live nearby.
Oh, that's
I
perfect.
love to read. I play golf. I We have a new puppy.
You've got it made in the shade.
I I do. I feel very fortunate, but I also had a great career as
Yeah,
a
I like it.
physician. I met
Mhm.
so many great families. I started a charity too,
Oh,
which
wow, that's
perhaps
amazing.
grounds me in many ways. It's now 28 years old.
Oh, wow, what's it called? What's
Started
your
I
charity?
started it 28 years ago. It's called the Hope and Heroes Children's Cancer Fund, and
Oh,
we
wow.
raise money for children with cancer. And I'm still very involved in that charity. And
Mhm,
we have a 7 hospital consortium in the New York metropolitan area. And we support patient needs, we support
mhm.
clinical trials and research. And it's been having that, I think that also grounded me in a sense of wanting to be certain that
Yeah,
charity was part
absolutely.
of this. And that's where the name comes from, both sides of the same coin, that despite the fact that families or people many times can have amassed great wealth, they have
Mhm,
a responsibility to give back.
and
And
that's one of the themes in your book as well, like you mentioned.
that's
Yeah,
one of the themes, yes.
great. So you mentioned earlier that you didn't have writer's block and that you didn't really experience that type of stall in writing, correct?
Correct.
Nice. So how long did it take you to complete your book where you thought that it would be ready for publishing as far as getting in touch with publishing?
Yeah, I thought it took me just shy of a year. I would say
Okay.
just about a
Great.
year. And I expect this second book, the sequel, to take about a year as well. But I
Okay.
already in my mind have the sequel, you
Laid
know,
out.
kind of laid out. I
Oh,
already know the issues that I want to address
It's really
like bullying, will be part of this. Like I want to continue the theme of people being able to make choices in life that are relevant. Here's one that I'm sure you would say, my goodness, really? I watched a child go through the trials and tribulations of having severe acne and being terribly isolated
oh,
because of it,
that
right?
was me. I can feel for that. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
I'm thinking that maybe one of the kids is going to experience that. I think that might be important.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, that makes me think. So, what would you say is the target audience then, as of your books? What did you have that in mind, or is there a certain
It's written for an adult audience.
right?
I
Okay,
don't, I don't think, I think there's
a little
the
heavy for
complexities and
yeah,
yeah, it's a little heavy for,
yeah,
for children.
yeah.
Although
Okay.
my granddaughter said to me the other day, she said to me, will you write a book with me, Grandpa? You write the book and I'll be the illustrator of the day I was born.
Oh, that's so
We'll
cute.
see.
Oh, that would be fun. That'd be a fun little project. How old is she or he?
He's 6.
Oh my gosh! Wow,
Yeah.
that's really cute. Well, can you share any I know you mentioned, like, kind of like your schedule, like, day to day, but can you share with us, like, any anecdotes of your writing experience or what kind of, like, your writing routine is that may works for you, that kinda keeps you going every day?
Yeah, my mornings are spent with on a long walk with the dog, working for the charity, the Hope
Mhm.
and Heroes for a couple of hours every morning, going to the gym. And in the afternoons, I
Right.
sit down and I will write for a couple of hours.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Great. What was I just there's so many parts of your book that are so interesting, but was there a part of your book personally that you felt was your favorite part to write or I guess like the most fun part to write? There's a lot of different things in your book that are really intriguing, but for you personally, can you pick out one or two?
There are a couple of things that I found that I was quite surprised that I was able to do. The one of the children of Patrick Doyle, the
Mhm,
Doyles have two daughters. One is Olivia, who
mhm,
had the bad accident and dealt with the disability. The
mhm,
other was Margaret, who was one of the women who started the company. Kindred Pendrose and Doyle was the name of the company that created an environment, Women for Women. And it was her husband that died of a drug overdose.
mhm,
And she's a very powerful woman. She has started this company and she starts to date men and she finds relationships and with men unsatisfying.
mhm,
She goes to an open school night at their children's school and she meets a black woman, an African American woman who is the math teacher,
mhm,
and the connection between them is quite immediate. They recognize that something is happening
mhm,
and they start dating
mhm,
and they marry. And I did not feel comfortable talking about a lesbian relationship, but I did take great care in writing about the tenderness and passion that
mhm.
two women might share. And I thought that came out really, I was very pleased with the way that
Wow, I love that.
yeah.
That's awesome.
That was a good section of the story.
Oh, that's awesome. What has been the nicest feedback or review you've received about both sides of the same coin?
Yeah, my sister read the book
Okay.
and she told me, she said it really is a great story. I was so surprised. Congratulations. I'm going to give it a
Wow.
9.
9 out of 10. That's great.
My children won't read it.
Oh, they won't read it?
No,
Oh,
they will not.
oh.
That's okay. And I've heard some friends and so forth who have read it tell me that they think it's a
I
good
love it.
a good story.
Yeah. I mean, I would think if I was from New York, same as yourself, just the elements of New York that you put in it would be so interesting if you're from, New York in that area. I think that would be really, really cool.
Yeah.
What advice would you give a person wishing to publish a book or is writing a book and wants to potentially go down that path? What would you say to them?
My experience was such that I just wanted to do it and I did it. I willed myself to do it.
Yeah.
I will say as it's not easy being an author today. And
Mhm.
I've learned that the writing of a book is the easy part, if you will. And now actually what I've decided to do is to take some creative writing courses. I mean, there's something locally called the Hudson Valley Writers Community or something, and
Oh,
they have
cool.
seminars and this. So I'm going to join that.
Okay.
Also through something called Substack. I
Oh,
don't know,
yeah. Yeah, I like Substack. I think
you
it's
know,
really cool.
so I'm starting to do that. But
Okay.
the hard part about writing a story is the path to publishing it.
Right.
It's very difficult for an
Mhm.
unknown author to find an agent, to get a book published by one of the major large publishing companies. Most
Mhm.
books today are self-published or
Mhm.
they are published in a hybrid fashion, the way that Archway does it.
Yeah.
You have to be realistic about, will the books sell? That to me is secondary.
Mhm.
People to read it because I think it's a really good story, but
Mhm.
I don't expect to have sales that are going to support the rest of my life or my
Mhm.
lifestyle. And
Mhm.
that I think is something that a writer has to be realistic and pragmatic about. It's
Right.
it's
Yeah.
it's
That's
just
yeah.
not.
Yeah. Okay. So, what do you hope your book brings to readers and people? What do you want them to take away from it at the end of
I
the
want people to read it. If people read this, I really think they're going to enjoy the story.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that, Emma. It's a darn good story. It really is. Could it be
Mhm.
better? Sure. Did I miss opportunities? Absolutely. Is it well written? It's okay. Could it have been better written? Sure. But on balance, it's a story that flows from beginning to middle to end
Mhm.
with an arc to it of rich characters,
Mhm.
and people will enjoy it. I just
I think
hope
so.
it finds an audience. That I hope you can help in that regard.
Yeah, yeah. So I hope that you out there have liked the plot. I mean, obviously when I was interviewing you, I was very intrigued by a lot of the historical elements of your book. So I hope you out there as well will check it out. And is there anything else you want to mention today, Michael, before we go?
I don't think so, Emma.
Okay.
I think we've really touched everything. I mean, the story is good, the history is accurate, the description
Mhm.
of locations are accurate, and I just think it's a wonderful tale of the 20th century,
Mhm.
demonstrating randomness of life and the importance of sharing and giving.
Mhm. That's awesome. That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Michael. If you wish to get Michael's book, head to both sides of the same coin. Head to archwaypublishing.com or Amazon and even Barnes and Noble. You can purchase it there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.